I'm going to go ahead and start and say thank all of you for joining us on this lovely, lovely, lovely Tuesday as we are starting Anti-Oedipus. After just finishing Anti-Oedipus, we have gone some 40 some weeks, 52 recordings, 140 hours of it total in order to get through Anti-Oedipus. And as we were looking back, we saw that our earlier recordings were not really representative of where we went as a group. And we wanted to go back and record a handful of them and start fresh, and also give people on the server a chance to really have these conversations with us. So if you want, I am going to share the text as I read. You can watch it in the chat. You check on my little name. You can read it as we go. We are starting over Anti-Oedipus, the translation by Lane, Hurley, and Seam. We're going to start with Desiring Machines. Every week we have gone through this and we've read a little bit more. You can just listen to the entire podcast. It's a book on tape, and we basically do a bit of an annotated version where every paragraph we're going to help people try to understand, and you will hear me, especially during these earlier sections, held through the whole book, asking questions and being generally confused. Fair way to put it. So I like to pretend I'm the cipher for the people who don't want to ask questions but don't understand it, because I do want to ask questions and I don't understand it. With that, I'm going to go ahead and dive into the text, and we are going to go paragraph by paragraph through the Desiring Machines, which is one of my favorite sections of the entire book. It is at work everywhere, functioning smoothly at times, at other times in fits and starts. It breathes, it eats, it heats, it shits and fucks. What a mistake to have ever said the id. Everywhere it is machines, real ones, not figurative ones. Machines driving other machines, machines being driven by other machines, with all the necessary couplings and connections. An organ machine is plugged into an energy source machine. The one produces a flow that the other interrupts. The breast is a machine that produces milk, and the mouth is a machine coupled to it. The mouth of the anorexic wavers between several functions. Its possessor is uncertain as to whether it is an eating machine, an anal machine, a talking machine, or a breathing machine. Asthma attacks. Hence we are all handymen, each with his own little machines. For every organ machine and energy machine, all the time, flows and interruptions. Judge Schreber has sunbeams in his ass, a solar anus, and rest assured that it works. Judge Schreber feels something, produces something, and is capable of explaining the process theoretically. Something is produced, the effects of a machine, not mere metaphors. It is so fun to reread this after reading the entire book.
Yeah, and then there's little things that we can actually notice that we probably didn't notice before. For example, when they start and they say, "What a mistake to have ever said the id." Everywhere it is machine. There's like 3 levels in the Freudian analysis: the I, the id, and the it. The I is person, or like the ego, and the superego is the id. And then there's the it, which is this unconscious. So what a mistake to ever said the id. So basically, it's what they're arguing for is a passage from the superego to the understanding of the it as the pre-individual machine that produces the subject. So even in the first sentence, we missed this the first time we read it, but it becomes pretty clear, because it's just not a play on words.
Yeah, so first of all, like what Jack said in chat, the superego is not the id. But I was also just wondering, because like this writing the id with D is like a very specific thing in English, and I know that, for example, in Freud's German, like the S is just S. There is no distinction between the neutral pronoun and like the S. And I was wondering how this works in French, whether like Freud's S is distinct, from from the other word "ça," I think it's translated. Like, is the distinction between it and it that is in the sentence, is it present in the French text?
Let me check this out.
Well, while Roger's diving into that, let's talk about really what they're opening up with, and it's a hell of a thing. And we are taking it for granted now that we've sort of read the entire book. But one of the major sort of plays with this, and Guattari goes over it, and deleuze goes over it, and throughout this book they go over it. But it's playing back to the idea of a materialist philosophy of psychoanalysis. One of the issues with a great deal of psychoanalysis that came before, and I know we have Ken in here who does a lot of Lacanian. I'm a bit of a Lacan fan myself. But a great deal of that is this idea that these thoughts are not these experiences, these thoughts, the way that we're driven is not at a material level, that there's a transcendental property, entire thing. And instead, the entire play here is saying, look, even Judge Schreber, who has sunbeams in his ass, who's a famous case that Freud had of a man who absolutely sort of went off the edge, but believed he had the sun coming out of his ass. Their point is simple. It's, look, it works. Judge Schreber feels a thing. It produces something, and it is capable of explaining the process theoretically. Something is produced. These are the effects of machines, not simply metaphors. The ability for us to see these things not as a play or as something that's just sort of happening, but instead that these are actual material realities that are happening inside our unconscious is, if there is a thesis that we're seeing here, it is that.
I would caution against taking this the sentence that the machines are not metaphors for like in machinic realism, in that sense, right? That these distinct machines are like real entities in the sense that they exist independent of their formulation and this text. I think it's closer to something that like the Bergsonian theory of images, in that it's like it's an aspect and tendency of the material that we are treating, and it's an abstraction in the sense that it's less than the material, but it's not a metaphor in the sense that it's not a representation, like a doubling of and in replacement of the real thing for another thing. It's like taking something away from the material reality in its treatment in the book, but not just like. Sorry, I'm rambling.
No, it's fair. It's a when I say that there's a machinic reality to it, I don't necessarily mean that there's literal machines operating that, but that these experiences, these desiring machines operate as if they were machines, that it's not some metaphor or some idea of some transcendental thing, but that you have this sort of unconscious that has functions in it, that produces, that works in a very specific way, instead of this miasma of things sort of running around, which is more the traditional psychoanalytic method of looking at it.
I think it is worth noting as well that Deleuze, and especially, doesn't really see a distinction between the material and the transcendental anyway. He believes in like a Spinozian one substance idea in the first place. So
that's a great point. Yes. Hello, webcam parent. Thank you for joining us. That's a great point. Love it.
Also, I've posted in chat earlier the blog post by Terence Blake, who has an alternative translation of this first paragraph and some remarks, including on the translation, which is really useful to look at if you have the time.
It's fantastic, and he's a friend of the server as well. Worth checking out.
Yeah, but if we go ahead though.
I just wanted to read what Terence Blake writes on the machine metaphor opposition. Kent, you're echoing. it's just really short, 2 sentences. There is an opposition between machine and metaphor that should not be blindly accepted. Machine is itself a frequent metaphor in French for talking about the state and its institutions and apparatuses, and it is used much more often than in English. The real opposition is between machine and structure. The point of encounter between Deleuze and Guattari was Guattari's text, Machine and Structure. The polemic against metaphor is subordinate to the polemic with structure and the critique of the signifier.
And we start getting into that. We were actually talking about it right before we started this, the sort of odd way that they intend to mean that they aren't speaking in metaphor. But they are. Absolutely what they're saying here is a poetic metaphor, and the way they're talking about it is, but they do not mean for it to be, as they say here, a mere metaphor. It's a difficult thing. We'll get more through that as we finish the rest of this section, and we'll dive in a little bit. It's pretty, I think.
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that when they say machine, they mean something prior to the distinction between nature and culture. So in English, the term machine is a little bit misleading because they're talking about something that is where you haven't distinguished between nature and culture yet, and that's why the breastfeeding is the primary metaphor, where you have two partial objects that connect together to become a desiring machine.
Think machination rather than robot.
Yeah,
actually, I like machination better than machine myself.
I can agree with that. All right, to the next paragraph. A schizophrenic out for a walk is a better model than a neurotic lying on the analyst's couch. A breath of fresh air, a relationship with the outside world. Linz's stroll, for example, is reconstructed by Buchner. This walk outdoors is different from the moments when Linz finds himself closeted with his pastor, who forces him to situate himself socially in relationship to the God of established relationship and religion, in relationship to his father, to his mother. While taking a stroll outdoors, on the other hand, he is in the mountains, mid falling snowflakes, with other gods or without any gods at all, without a family, without a father or a mother, with nature. What does my father want? Can he offer me more than that? Impossible. Leave me in peace. Everything is a machine. Celestial machines, the stars or rainbows in the sky, alpine machines, all of them connected to those of his body. Continual whir of machines. He thought that it must be a feeling of endless bliss to be in contact with the profound life of every form, to have a soul for rocks, metal, water, and plants, to take into himself, as in a dream, every element of nature, like flowers that breathe, the waxing and waning of the moon. To be a chlorophyll or a photosynthesis machine, or at least slip his body into such machines as one part among the others. Linz has projected himself back to a time before the man-nature dichotomy, where all the coordinates based on this fundamental dichotomy have been laid down. He does not live nature, but as a process of production. There is no such thing as either man or nature now, only a process that produces the one within the other, and couples the machines together. Producing machines, desiring machines, everywhere. Schizophrenic machines, all of species life. Self and the non-self, outside and inside, no longer have any meaning whatsoever. God, this early stuff is so much more poetic than the later sections.
It's actually insane how much they're saying there. I mean, almost the entire text is outlined just from that one paragraph in so many ways. And particularly with like this breakdown of territories with the schizophrenic who just has no cares whatsoever. Like when they're talking about, the celestial bodies are machines connected to his body, like they're being literal in that the schizophrenic actually believes this. There's no barrier between his body and the outside world.
And conversely, when he's talking about Linz being closeted with his pastor, forced himself to situate socially in a relationship with God, it's obviously him and Guattari having the same commentary, sort of in their takedown of psychoanalysis and being stuck on the couch, and how very often we don't realize that on the couch, or in this case, situated socially with the pastor, the machines are operating in a very specific way, and the connections are a very specific thing that influences what may happen inside of that situation, in the same way that being free out in nature allows you to connect with a great deal more. And ultimately, as they say, it's a better model than the neurotic lying on the couch, because everything is a machine. You can have more connections, you can find more and discover more about yourself. It's amazing to see this stuff after reading so much of the rest of the book.
Little comment between French and English. Everything is a machine. In French, it's tout fait machine, which is like everything makes machine. So there's a form of action into like not producing machine or not becoming machine, but everything makes machine. So it's like it's machinic work, like an ongoing machinic work, if we want. So like the transition is not that off, but just the form makes it that everything is a machine. It's like you're making a statement that an ontological statement that everything is a machine, but like what they're saying in French is everything makes machine. I don't know.
Sorry.
I don't know how to like translate it correctly, but there's like an action form into the sentence in French.
I do think that is actually a relevant distinction, and I suppose it's just more present in A Thousand Plateaus than in this work. But it's clear that I don't know what Guattari thinks about this, but Deleuze certainly views everything as being a process, as stuff in motion. He doesn't think of anything as a static is. And you very rarely see him actually say, "This is this thing." He usually prefers to use something changing.
Yeah, you're right. And when we talk about assemblages, for example, or arrangement in Ian Buchanan's translation, what they say originally is, you're not interested into the component of the assemblage, but what the assemblage does. So how the assemblage produces thing. So there's always this, this understanding and this preoccupation for the products, the processes, and how an arrangement of a multiple creates things that are outside of their own composition.
Well, I think also that there is no such thing as an individual, that there are only assemblages.
Yeah, also. Because it always comes from a multiple.
Sorry, if someone else wants to say something, they can.
Sorry. I was just going to make a quick comment that, in fact, later in his career, Deleuze actually starts calling individuals dividuals in his postscript on the Society of Control.
Yeah, or non-totalizable multiplicities is another one he likes a lot.
Okay, so I wanted to just go on to something that Brooks said. So because Brooks talked about the lens feeling actually Deleuze and Guattari talk about lens being closeted in with the pastor, and Brooks made the connection to the therapy session and a confession.
And the direct Oedipalization, because that's what, in relation to his father, his mother, whereas while he's wandering, he's able to actually make the connections and have discussions. What does my father want? Which is actually having the real question about what is his father's desiring machines actually.
Yeah. I totally get this in general, how therapy maps onto confession. But specifically in the case of lens, I don't think there are any confession situations that are happening. And the last time I've read this was basically when we first read this section. When I read Lens was actually when we first read this section. So it's been a while.
Well, correct me. He doesn't actually visit his pastor in the text, does he?
Oberlin is the pastor.
Yes.
The pastor is his host in the valley, and the whole thing, like I think this what they are talking about here, closeted in, really relates much more to the general situation that Lenz faces within the village, and specifically in the house of the pastor, rather than any specific confession scene or anything. because I don't think that I'm not even sure. Like, isn't Oberlin even Protestant, and there isn't really confession stuff? Like, yeah. I like, it's a minor point because I think the larger point still stands, but I think the opposition here is really much more between just socialized life and the schizophrenic free flowing life process in nature than the specific situation of therapy and confession. We are not at that point yet, because I don't think there's
not necessarily specifically what I'm attaching to is when it says that he is forced, and from what, and again, I haven't read this again since we read this the last time, but when he is forced to situate himself socially in relationship to the God of religion, his father and his mother, when he's in the house, when he's having those discussions, it's not necessarily even a confession, but he's being Oedipalized because of the social situations he's in versus the free walking out into the forest where he makes his breakthroughs, is how I read the text. It may not be a confession directly, and I'm probably conflating a couple of things, but that's the difference.
Okay, I don't think we need to dwell on this too long. We should, like, I encourage everyone to vote for reading Lens in the Lit group so we can have this discussion at length.
True. If you're listening to this, we do have a literature group who basically exists, thanks to Jack and Lou and a few others, to make the readings that we need to read in order to understand Anti-Oedipus, something that we can go over other times. So please join the lit group if you feel the need, and Lens would be a good read soon.
Well, I suppose along that same line, something else that's being subtly referenced here is obviously Rousseau, who originally made this distinction between nature and civilization. And then in his speech, Derrida famously attacked this exact position. And obviously Derrida was a big influence on Deleuze. And so they're kind of subtly making fun of Rousseau for thinking that there was this abstract, like, exact divide between nature and man in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's right, especially because, like, where I read the point about man without, or the person without gods, or without family, it's a very similar point to what you're making there, that there's not this distinction any more than it's like the family enables the person to be.
Yeah, it's a false binary that they're tearing down, right? I think it's almost a misreading to think that they view nature as the escape or whatever. It's more just that to them there is no difference between nature and civilization, or it's just a meaningless binary of opposition.
Yeah, and the ontological turn in anthropology that has been going on for, like, I would say, like 7-8 years. Most people, in anthropology, we maintain the big separation between nature, culture was a big thing, and it started to be deconstructed, and the ontological turn actually espoused Deleuze and Guattari a lot more through, like, firstly with Latour, which even he doesn't recognize himself being part of this turn, but like there's this reversal where we believe that the separation of those two realms are products of an apparatus of power. So there's even social sciences are starting to recognize that this was a false dichotomy.
Yeah, let's step back and I'd like to try to simplify it. This paragraph is talking about I should just ask, what is this paragraph trying to say? And let's try to really simplify, because I'd rather not, we should try not to use examples from later in the book as an example, or we should avoid, Roger, 1,000 plateau examples, saying. But
okay.
What I read into this, and it's essentially what I was talking about earlier with Lens, but let's leave the Lens example out of it, is that when Lens, as a specific example, when he does move out and he's walking through the forest, he's making connections with the things there. He is becoming nature. It's not so much anymore that he is a part of the society, or he's in the house, or he's doing things, but instead he's able to make connections in lots of different ways, as it says, with metals, with the stones, with the rocks, with plants, all of these things. The ability for sort of this overall connection, not living nature as nature, but as a process of production. He is not there thinking, well, I am in nature, I am separate from it, but instead he's connecting to it, and he's allowing his connections with nature to make his brain and his desiring machines connect in new ways. Because ultimately, desiring machines, schizophrenizing machines, everything is everywhere. There is no, oh, this is a machine because I'm connecting with my mom. This is my mommy machine. It's like, no, everything is a machine. Everything causes production that is real at some level.
I think it's in general as well, just that they're expanding on what they mean by a schizophrenic very early on, so that we get a grasp for it. In that he has there's no boundary right there. Like, he's just like going outside. Yeah, this rock is a part of my soul. You know, whatever. Why not? Why not cross all boundaries? Why territorialize yourself to any assemblage?
Yeah. And so, like, one of the big things here as I read this is, like you're saying, it's an expansion on the first paragraph, because they're talking about how desiring production, at least how I read this, how desiring production enables all of this, right? So, like what Roger said, machines are, I think you said something like machines are produced, or something to that effect. Everything produces a machine. I think they mean to say desiring production enables the machinic. And at the same time as the machinic is intimately bound up in desiring production. So with the schizophrenic, it's not the person, right? It's that all these connections between machines are moving through this process that is schizophrenic in this case, which is flows of desiring production. This is where the big distinction with the id, I think, is. It's not as though an id is desiring all this. It's that desiring production is flowing in throughout these different machines.
And it's important to talk about where this is coming about. It's a time in the history of psychoanalysis, philosophy, continental theory, where people are really starting to play with sort of some of those classic ideas that had been very built into the way that a lot of this is done. Anti-Oedipus, specifically, having the name Oedipus in the title, is obviously a rallying cry against the Oedipalization, or the concept of Oedipus, these rules that Freud had said from the beginning a man has in his heart, that you're born with these sort of setups, that you have these three parts to your psyche. You have your ego, your id, your superego, the id, which is your baser sort of desires and needs, sort of the animalistic-ish side. Ken, feel free to correct me on any of this. The ego, which is essentially yourself, and then superego, which is your sort of demand for pleasure, your cry for doing more. Ken, you want to jump in and fix anything I just said?
I don't know if I can fix anything. It all sounded good to me.
All right.
Yeah.
So they're entering this, and the idea at the time is that essentially you have an unconscious, and this is something that still carries through today, is that there's this unconscious or subconscious sort of miasma where thoughts and ideas and everything sort of are flowing around, and the things that come out of it we almost can't help, and we need to be thinking about this. Jack, if you want to fight about superego and pleasure, we can do that.
I mean, I don't mind elaborating on that as well, if I might.
Please, Jack, why don't you start, and then we'll jump to.
Okay, so my understanding is that the id, so the Freudian unconscious is tripartite, right? It's got three parts: the id, ego, and the superego. As I understand it, the id desires, right? So in that sense, the id wants things, and it's trying to, it creates a kind of tension here. What's happening, like, is the id will, for instance, say hungry, and it's trying to satisfy that want. The ego, in relation to the id here, develops to start sort of directing the id, because this is where I think Freud even makes the distinction between, like, the neurotic and the psychotic, is like how it is whether or not the ego is basically directing the id or not. If the id directs the ego, I believe that's a form of psychotic. So in that case, right, the id operates with this tension with the ego because the ego is trying to release this tension and satisfy the id. So id says hungry, and id sees it will connect that with the cardboard. So the ego's role is to say, no, id, you're not hungry for cardboard. You want the breast. You want milk. Right, that will satisfy the hunger. Where the superego comes in is something like we might call it like a social conscience, and that's kind of, it's at least a place to start. It's not really a conscience in that sense, but my understanding is the superego functions basically in the social dynamic, which is to say, right, you shouldn't breastfeed past a certain age, right? You see this kind of played with in Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, actually. But the superego functions in the unconscious this way to now begin regulating the id and the ego and how this tension is released. So how it's appropriate socially to be released and how it's inappropriate socially to be released.
All right, I shouldn't be flippant with these conversations. There. Webcam, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's worth noting that a big part of psychoanalysis up until now, from both Freud and obviously Lacan's extensions to it, was that the idea was that the individual had like a hole in themselves, and then they like desired to fill that hole in themselves from things from the outside. But the point that like Deleuze and Guattari are making already here even is that no, desire is an act of creation. You're not filling a hole. You're looking at things and you're drawing borders and you're saying this is an assemblage, and then you want the assemblage. So it's not to fulfill something within you. Everything, like all these desires, are acts of creation.
Excellent.
Yeah, and that's that's why the bricoleur part is so important there, right? Because you work with what's in relation to you, even though you and that what's in relation to you is in itself produced in this manner, but you're caught up in what's available for connections.
I suppose it's connected to that Heideggerian, thank you, sense of being in the world are one and the same, as well, as opposed to this sharp distinction in psychoanalysis and the Oedipal complex between the individual and the world.
Yeah, exactly, right. This is where they're taking down these binaries of man, nature, right? We find man in nature as we find nature in man. There's not this clear distinction. There's no external self or internal self, right? They're taking down a lot of these binaries to open up space for this kind of simultaneity, like you're saying too. Also to take away, like, it's not the familial that enables this. It's not divinities that enable this, right? Desiring production is allowing for this machinic happening.
So when I like looking at this paragraph, especially as a person who was new to like this text, my first thought is, why are we defining human in like machine terms, as in like its very nature and purpose is to produce, as opposed to being and that being enough in itself? And then that thought goes to him being in nature and how like that experience is allowing him to be freed from that kind of box of my purpose is to produce or to satisfy the expectations of the people around me. But instead I can just be just like a rock can just be, and it has purpose in its being, and it doesn't have to produce anything unto the world. And that creates this sense of freedom. In a way, that's what I'm getting from this paragraph.
So this is one of those fun things that I think we've gone over a bunch of times alongside this whole reading. One of the difficulties is the use of the word machine in English, to me. So when we talk about the machines producing, machines have a lot of, the word machine has a lot of baggage in it in English. It's industrial. It's very focused on sort of the classic proletarian production. It's something that has to be generated. It has to be useful. I I much prefer thinking about, and the other way they talk about this, and Roger or anyone, feel free to jump in and correct me, is apparatus as another word that they use. And that tends to be something that's pushed a little bit more in their later texts. And they use apparatus a lot more in A Thousand Plateaus and their other writings. I know Guattari does in Chaosophy a lot more as well. It's not so much that we have to be producing, that we have this impetus. It's that we are. It's that by nature, humans at their basic level desire things, that we want stuff. When we're born, the first thing we want is want. We just want. And it's not so much that we necessarily have to produce or that there's this impetus, but that because we desire and because we have that in us, there's a lot of ways to look at desire. And one is that desire is a kind of scary, awful thing. And that's the sort of Freudian side of it, where we go, oh, look, desire needs to be, you need to put a collar on it and a leash, and we need to be very careful about how desire gets out. You have to watch it. This is the job of the superego, is regulating that desire, regulating that id. And Deleuze goes, wait, no. Desire itself is actually just what we do. We desire, and desire is produced by existing as a human. And they go through sort of the setups, assemblages. Thank you. It's not apparatus, assemblages. So it's that we produce desire just by existing and by moving from moment to moment. And we get a little bit into this in later sections, and also in Logic of Sense, sort of the nature of existence is this desire. And so it's not so much that production or work is the thing we need to be thinking about, but it's that they're saying that just by desiring, these machines that are created with desire, and when we're first born, they're very simple. We just have desires outward. We want the breast, we want to shit, we want to eat, we want whatever. And then over time, our desires get more and more complicated, needs to satisfy those. As we start growing and as these things start changing, society around us is formed as sort of this large scale thing that helps build these assemblages and builds these setups within us and connects to our internal desiring machines. That's why I hate the word machines. But it's not so much that it's an impetus that we have to be producing, it's that we are. And that desire is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. We don't need to be ascetic. We don't need to be chasing it away. So it's the use of machine that I think pushes us into this idea that it needs to be a productive desire. And it's like, no, desire itself is productive, is what they're saying. But not productive necessarily in sort of the Marxist classic sort of setup there, but much more in the I have natural needs. Does that help at all with what you're asking?
Yeah, I appreciate that explanation. But then that leads me to the next thought of even words like assemblage and apparatus seem still pretty cold and clinical and distant.
They are, and the idea is the idea and usage of assemblage or machine or any of these is this concept that we have an assemblage that produces. So desire comes out of me, and let's say it's flowing like water. At some point, that water needs to be diverted into different things. Not all of us are the same. Not all of us are doing the same thing. I've got a whole bunch of books and video games in front of me and all kinds of stuff. How do I pick and choose what I read, what I like, what movies I watch, what job I do, what friends I have, all of these things? And their argument is, at a basic level, that it's not so much like the classic, I'm with the people who fulfill my needs, but instead that these assemblages that you have inside of you and that you build with other people, by nature, the structure of them push desire in different places. They block it in some ways, they push it to being revealed in other ways, but desire is being manipulated by the assemblages. And so it's an idea of thinking that the structure of a thing is what's determinate.
Right. I think that's the simple distillation to her critique, and her question, I think, is that they're coming from, a way of doing philosophy that is structural or post-structural. So they're going to do a lot of constructing language.
Yeah, and then with all of those understandings, I'm also looking at this specific paragraph and comparing and contrasting that with.
I think you cut out.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we lost you after compare and contrasts.
Yeah, I was saying comparing and contrasting everything you were saying about desire and assemblages and all of that with nature and the fact that like in nature there's no conversation about what does a tree or a plant or a rock or anything want or desire. And there is a type of like peace in that. And um because you're now there's like none of that turmoil of all this subconscious and things going on beneath the surface that we don't realize, and things on the surface that we are battling with. It's just things are just being and existing, and yeah, not necessarily wanting or desiring anything. And that there's peace in knowing that in a way we are of of this thing that can just exist even without the desires, even without the subconscious level of things, if that makes sense.
I think
So
I'd like to mention that the reason they use the word machine is that they're trying to point to the reality of existence as the primary thing they're trying to get at. And because Kantian philosophy is all about possibilities and not about reality, so they're trying to switch to focusing on reality. And I think a way to think about it is like the cells in the body, right? So you can see them as like little machines, and they need certain things to continue to exist, like oxygen that they get from the blood and so forth, and nutrients and so forth. And so if you think about these machines as being like the cells in the body, then you can see that we're talking about the real cells in a real body of an individual person, right? That's what they're talking about. And somehow that's prior to the nature culture, because if that body didn't exist, then it couldn't have language, it couldn't be social, it couldn't have consciousness. And so they're trying to get at that fundamental reality that's prior to the arising of culture and our ideas of nature as something we can exploit or take resources from or whatever, and separate ourselves from.
okay,
Yeah.
so sorry. Oh, okay, go for it.
No, sorry, but I was just gonna say that makes sense. I get that, but I'm also talking about the idea that, and maybe this could be right or wrong, but I'm also talking about the idea that this body that we have in this moment has all of these, all these processes that are happening on a cellular level, on so many levels. But I'm also thinking about the idea that when this body is gone, when, we go back to the earth, we also become a part of the earth. And there's just that idea, that continuation that, then.
Well, it's one of those things that they get into with their later metaphor of the orchid and the wasp, which is incidentally the name of our zine. The nature of us is that the process that we're talking about here of these desiring machines, how they play with each other, how they play with the trees inside of this walk, how they play with the metals and the stones and world. The process that's happening is where our subject exists, the sort of classic human subject. This is where I appear, is inside of these processes in a constant state of becoming. And these processes never stop. There's no point where it's like, cool, oh, all the processors are done. Here's your Brooks, ding, the microwave's finished. It's that these are always ongoing, and that I exist. I have this sort of ongoing, with the tree machine, I am becoming tree when I'm hugging it and when I'm connecting with it, or I'm becoming Jeep when I'm riding in my Jeep. I'm becoming various versions of Brooks pretty much constantly, because the desiring machines that sort of are around us are always making these connections, and it's very much focused on where my subjectivity is at any given time that determines who I am.
So I disagree with this in a sense, I think, and I have to figure this out as I go. Because, so first of all, when we speak about desire, we are talking about like libido, we're talking about the energy of that is actually directed. We're talking about the flows. And we are not talking about desire that belongs to a subject, right? So this, it's not our desires, it's not these machines' desires in the sense that they are closed entities that somehow contain this desire. The desire flows through the machines, right? So, and then the machines, as I said, are images. They are cuts in the flows. They are cuts in the processes. They are not static things in this sense. They are not like a fundamental reality. They are still like they make up the entities we can talk about, but they are not like a more fundamental reality. And
no, this is Lou's getting at one of the things that's sorry to interrupt, Lou. I'm wanting to get to the next paragraph and charge a little bit ahead.
Yes, I'm just trying to get to the point where we lose this attachment to existing individualities within this process where we talk about now, because that's exactly the point what they make with Lenz here. Lenz is losing his individuality by diving into the general process of reality producing itself, reality becoming. This is not tied to any subject. In fact, it is the opposite. It's tied to the dissolution of Lenz's subject. And in that sense, we cannot talk about a tree or anything just being, because a tree, besides being a living being, for one, is also part of the product of the world, right? It's first of all, it's also an image, as is our body. Our body is also an image. Our cells are images, but it's a process that has different tendencies that cut each other, which become these images.
Well, and actually, the next paragraph is about that, almost to a T. It gets into Beckett and a little bit of the Oedipalization. Before we dive in, I want to talk about real quick Oedipus as a psychoanalytic subject, because it's going to be really important and central to this entire thing. The core idea of Oedipus is that when we exist and born into a family with a mother, father, and my relationship is very simple. As a man, as a young boy, I am sexually attracted to my mother. She is my object of desire through the breast. She is the first woman I've come to see. My father, on the other hand, is my rival for her love, and ultimately my the sort of symbol of law, the symbol of power, and the thing that is stopping me from being able to consummate my love with mother. This is kind of the underlying Oedipal
intrigue.
Yes, this is the underlying Oedipal thing. And so psychoanalysis for a very long time, and this is from Freud on, spends most of its time actually trying to get us right with Oedipus. And they believe very much, the early psychoanalysts, and even some still today, believe very much that Oedipus is this driving force, and that when we're out of whack, when we're not properly Oedipalized, when we had an unhealthy relationship with our mother that was over-sexualized, or perhaps our father wasn't there, or that our father was abusive or absent or weak, that's the reason that I grew up malformed. The really big sort of underlying thing. And again, the book is called Anti-Oedipus. You may guess they're not exactly a fan. So I'm going to dive into the next paragraph. And if you have further questions on any of that or want to have the discussion, we have our chat running in the background for a reason. Now that we have had a look at this stroll of a schizo, let us compare what happens when Samuel Beckett's characters decide to venture outdoors. Their various gaits and methods of self-locomotion constitute, in and of themselves, a finely tuned machine. And then there is the function of the bicycle in Beckett's works. What relationship does the bicycle horn machine have with the mother Anish machine? Well, to quote, "What a rest to speak of bicycles and horns. Unfortunately, it is not of them I have to speak, but of her who brought me into this world through a hole in her ass, if my memory is correct." Right, wonderful joke. Love Beckett. It is often thought that Oedipus is an easy subject to deal with, something perfectly obvious, a given that is there from the very beginning. This is not so at all. Oedipus presupposes a fantastic repression of desiring machines. Why are they repressed? To what end? Is it really necessary or desirable to submit to such repression? And what means are to be used to accomplish this? What ought to go inside the Oedipal triangle? What sort of thing is required to construct it? Are a bicycle horn and my mother's arse sufficient to do the job? Aren't there more important questions than these, however? Given a certain effect, what machine is capable of producing it? And given a certain machine, can it be used for? Can we possibly guess, for instance, what a knife rest is used for if all we are given is a geometrical description of it? Or yet another example on being confronted with a complete machine made up of 6 stones in the right-hand pocket of my coat, pocket that serves as the source of the stones. 5 stones in my right-hand pocket of my trousers, 5 in the left-hand pocket, transmission pockets, with the remaining pocket of my coat receiving the stones that have already been handled. As each of the stones moves forward 1 pocket, how can we determine the effect of this circuit of distribution in which the mouth, too, plays a role as a stone-sucking machine? Where in this entire circuit do we find the production of sexual pleasure? At the end of Malone Dies, Lady Petal takes the schizophrenics out for a ride in a van and a rowboat. And on the picnic, in the midst of nature, an infernal machine is being assembled. Under the skin, the body is an overheated factory, and outside, invalid shines, glows from every burst pore. Again, going into the idea of what they mean by machine, they don't, again, necessarily mean it quite in the literal way, being metaphorical, but it's not mere metaphor. I remember going through all of this. One of the ones I want to definitely go over is the stone-sucking machine that they mention. The machine made of 6 stones in a pocket. Character, I believe it's Malloy. God, someone who knows Beckett better perhaps will correct me. Has multiple stones in all of his jacket pockets, and he moves them from one to another and then one into his mouth and sucks on the stones. He takes it out, puts it in a pocket, and he's basically developed this method that allows him to suck on all the stones. Now, outright, as they say here, where is the production of sexual pleasure inside the machine? How does this machine operate? Where does it work? And when we have all of these pieces, in itself, the machine itself doesn't actually have directly sexual pleasure. Actually, these machines it's about how they connect to other machines. It's ultimately what they're talking about here. Am I wrong about that one, Lou? Roger? Did I lose everyone?
I have a question about just the terms that they're using. When they're using terms like schizo and neurotic, are they talking about the commonly held like clinical definitions of schizophrenia and neuroticism, or are they talking about a different philosophical definition of these terms?
Generally, both. The answer is going to be both. It's a little bit more of, I would say, when they use the terms, they're using what I would say is the more psychoanalytic definition of them, but it's very much a clinical setup. But they're talking mostly about, in the 70s, not now. Like we have to rewind a great deal. It's been 50 years, a lot of DSM changes since then in a lot of ways. So it's the time frame is important, but they are talking clinically. It's very much about the psychoanalytic sort of way of referring to things.
Yes, and we need to be very careful here because this is one of the major misunderstandings with their use of the schizophrenic and paranoiac. The terms they're working with here have changed quite a bit. So they exist in juxtaposition with the psychoanalytic understanding and the clinical meaning. So it's not that they're talking about the schizophrenic in that pure sense of the clinic. They're talking about the schizophrenic process, which one isn't located in an individual. This isn't a person doing this. This is something the person is finding themselves in, while in relation to all these other things within that process, right? These are the connections they're talking about between machines. It's a schizophrenic process. So a series of machines. It's not a person doing this or a person beleaguered by this. And two, you see here, one of the big moves they're making here too is to say that, like, when psychoanalysis deals with people in this sense, right, there's a way in which Oedipus is taken to be the subject and is taken not only, instead of Oedipus having been produced or anything like that, it sort of starts with as a presupposition, right? It's kind of transcendent in that sense. And it sort of stands in for the person here. What they're breaking apart with their discussion of Malloy here and the mother ass machine and all that is that this neat triangle, one, in and of itself has been produced, and two, can't be taken as a given or a presupposed model for how this all comes together. So the schizophrenic, this is just like what we said about the family, the deities and all that. This process doesn't rely on, it's not enabled, nor does it rely on things like divinities, on the family, or those matters. Desiring production is what animates, and that's what that last quote from Artaud, I think, is really showing, is that the machinic process is happening.
Yeah, so when encountering these terms, read these as they would have been understood when this text was written.
Yeah, I'll also
read them with the realization that they don't mean it in the psychoanalytic sense. They're changing the meaning of it.
As someone who's also like fairly new to Deleuze, I'll also say that when you're very first starting out, you have no idea what the fuck they're talking about, and then once you get further in, you see the terms more. Even just a few pages, it all starts to come together, and it's also really difficult if you're only a little bit in to even understand the explanations other people try to give you of the terms, because it just comes together the more you read, but you'll figure it out.
A very fair way to put it. It's a leap of faith in the text for sure, but it does start coming together.
Okay. And then last point, this is not there's no analysis or anything like that. Just mother anus is that's an odd term. It's a very interesting choice of words.
Well, it's a reference to Beckett's character, who says, the quote is, wants to speak of bicycles and horns because it's, oh, how nice that would be. Unfortunately, it's not them I have to speak, but of my mother who brought me into this world through a hole in her ass, if the memory is correct. And so it's the way that he's making this connection, and that's their point here, is you've got this connection between the horns and then the mother ass. These machines, the way that these apparatuses operate, it's meant to be vulgar, it's meant to be provocative, but there is connections there, and why is the question that they're asking.
And to clarify too, that's exactly right, Brooks. And again, they're trying to get away from starting with Oedipus in this sense, to say that Malone here is doing this in relation to Oedipus is to completely miss what he's saying in this context.
Yes.
There's, especially because if you notice, there's a flow. He moves from bicycles and horns to the mother, but it's not the mother in the typical, like, where he's talking about his memory of being and I think this comes up throughout that play, of coming out of her ass rather than the normal exit. So this is the point, is to say that there's not an innate idea here for this character. They don't think of themselves as being naturally Oedipus. And to read the footnote, which is really important here, in terms of Oedipus, As will be seen below, the term Oedipus has many widely varying connotations in this volume. It refers, for instance, not only to the Greek myth of Oedipus and to the Oedipus complex as defined by classical psychoanalysis, but also to Oedipal mechanisms, processes, and structures. The translators follow the author's use and employ the word Oedipus by itself, using the more traditional term Oedipus complex only when the authors do so, and that's the translator's note. So keep that in mind as we read, that they're using Oedipus in this kind of, there's a sense of collectivity with it, but you've got to do some of the work to understand how they mean it here.
And I'm going to go ahead and continue to the next paragraph. Any last comments on this one or questions here? I know we could spend hours. Any major questions here or parts that just aren't quite clicking, which is fine because we'll be continuing and things start coming together pretty quick. This does not mean that we are attempting to make nature one of the poles of schizophrenia. What the schizophrenic experiences, both as an individual and as a member of the human species, is not at all any one specific aspect of nature, but nature as a process of production. What do we mean here by process? It is probable that at a certain level, nature and industry are two separate and distinct things. From one point of view, industry is the opposite of nature. From another, industry extracts its raw materials from nature. From yet another, it returns its refuse to nature, so on. Even within society, this characteristic man-nature, industry-nature, society-nature relationship is responsible for the distinction of relatively autonomous spheres that are called production, distribution, consumption. But in general, this entire level of distinctions, examined from the point of view of its formal developed structures, presupposes, as Marx has demonstrated, not only the existence of capital and the division of labor, but also the false consciousness that the capitalist being necessarily acquires, both of itself and of the supposedly fixed elements within an all-over process. Or the real truth of the matter, the glaring, sober truth that resides in delirium, is that there is no such thing as relatively independent spheres or circuits. Production is immediately consumption and a recording process, without any sort of mediation. And the recording process and consumption directly determine production, though they do so within the production process itself. Hence everything is production. Production of productions, of actions, passions, productions of recording process, distributions, and of coordinates that serve as points of reference. Productions of consumptions, of sensual pleasures, of anxieties, of pain. Everything is production, since the recording processes are immediately consumed, immediately consummated, and these consumptions directly reproduced. This is the first meaning of process as we use the term, incorporating recording and consumption within production itself, thus making them the productions of one and the same process.
So one thing that should be mentioned here is that they're kind of basing what they're writing on Grundrisse, which I think was published first in the 70s, or late 60s, and but it was a manuscript by Marx that was never published. And in it there's like a Hegelian analysis of the relationships between consumption and production and exchange and distribution. And what they're adding here is storage, or the recording process or inscription as another process that's not really talked about in Grundrisse.
That could be. I think I read it as they're trying to talk about how Marx understands that production, this distinction between production, distribution, and consumption, as though they're three spheres that just kind of exist, somehow determinate of one another, but yet separate from one another, is to miss the mark, right? Because it's a complete process, which, as you're pointing out, they're going to take this process of production, right, of production, distribution, and consumption, and this distinction between the production as industrial and nature, right, as though they're separate, and quash that distinction. right? So it's not as though production is unnatural, and it's not as though the natural doesn't produce. So in doing this, right, they're taking this distinction from Marx, and now they're starting to walk it into what they're going to do with it, which is to basically is to reconceptualize it. I guess they're going to conceptualize it differently through recording. Well, as we'll see later through the syntheses, but we don't want to go too deep into that right now. They just want to start out with process here.
Right. I just like to mention that in Grundrisse, Marx is analyzing consumption and production and distribution and exchange, showing how they turn into each other in a Marxian way. And they're going beyond that and saying, well, these distinctions aren't the key thing. The key thing is that all of it is production.
Something that I noticed, and this isn't super related, but it kind of is that they're, to me at least, sort of saying that they're going to do for Freud what sort of Marx did for the other leading economists at his time, in the sense that they're going to not only prove him wrong, but to sort of situate him in his historical context.
Yeah, another point is that there's a really good commentary by Daniel Smith on this, where he basically says that what they're doing is bringing Keynesian economics to Marx and Freud, and that so when they talk about flows and storage and those things, that those are terms from Keynesian economics that see economics as a flow. And that's kind of what they're bringing to both Marx and Freud at the same time.
Let's go back to process, though, because this is something that comes up a lot in our discussions, especially in terms of like how to understand the interrelationship of the process, right? How does it kind of work in and of itself? So where they write everything is production, since the recording processes are immediately consumed, immediately consummated, and these consumptions directly reproduced. This is the first meaning of process as we use the term, incorporating recording and consumption within process itself, thus making them the productions of one and the same process. So we already talked about how this flows together and works as a process, in the sense of that these distinctions don't exist isolated from each other, which I think is fairly clear. The other thing I want to focus on is this point about immediacy, right? There's also a simultaneity here in the sense that like what is produced, right? These connections, or like with the breast and the milk in the mouth, right? Consumption is happening there, as is recording. So the process itself has the simultaneity, which is this process, which is the following of the flow here.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That point about immediacy, I think, is really important because I'm trying to figure out how is this different from Marx, and where is this? So because we see how Freud is being challenged, what about Marx are they keeping? What are they discarding? And I guess my sense of Marx is that he, like Hegel, is a philosopher of mediation, right? I think Marx would say everything is mediated. There is there's mediation within the social structure. There's mediation by, I think he calls it the social relations of production, the class differences. And so you never get direct production, I think, for Marx. And I think that's what they want to challenge. So Marx has that vision of a kind of liberation of society, right? And the capitalist class imposes a kind of false consciousness ideology, but then communism can sort of rise up, the proletariat can rise up. And it seems like what they want to do is to, reject that distinction, I guess, between worker and owner or capitalist. It seems like they want to say, no, primarily there is this like field of flows, and you don't distinguish there. Distinctions only come later. And that's I guess that's how I'm reading the immediacy.
Well,
that
it's
everything is sort of this primal soup almost.
You're spot on, Al Dreams, and I think I'm going to continue the next paragraph because it continues that thought. Second, we make no distinction between man and nature. The human essence of nature and the natural essence of man become one within nature in the form of production and industry, just as they do within the life of man as a species. Industry is then no longer considered from the extrinsic point of view of utility, but rather from the point of view of its fundamental identity with nature as production of man and by man. Not man as the king of creation, but rather as the being who is in intimate contact with the profound life of all forms or all types of beings, who is responsible for even the stars and animal life, and who ceaselessly plugs an organ machine into an energy machine, a tree into his body, a breast into his mouth, the sun into his asshole, the eternal custodian of the machines of the universe. This is the second meaning of process as we use the term. Man and nature are not like two opposite terms confronting each other, not even in the sense of bipolar opposites within a relationship of causation, ideation, or expression, cause and effect, subject and object, etc. Rather, they are one and the same essential reality, the producer-product. Production as process overtakes all idealistic categories and constitutes a cycle whose relationship to desire is that of an immanent principle. That is why desiring production is the principal concern of a materialist psychiatry, which conceives of and deals with the schizo as homo natura. This will be the case, however, only on one condition, which in fact constitutes the third meaning of process as we use the term. It must not be viewed as a goal or an end in itself, nor must it be confused with an infinite perpetuation of itself. Putting an end to the process or prolonging it indefinitely, which, strictly speaking, is tantamount to ending it abruptly or prematurely, is what creates the artificial schizophrenic found in mental institutions. Limp rag, forced into autistic behavior, produced as an entirely separate and independent entity. D.H. Lawrence says of love, "We have pushed a process into a goal. The aim of any process is not the perpetuation of that process, but the completion thereof. The process should work to a completion, not to some horror of intensification and extremity, wherein the soul and body ultimately perish. Schizophrenia is like love. There is no specifically schizophrenic phenomenon or entity. Schizophrenia is the universe of productive and reproductive desiring machine, universal primary production as the essential reality, man. Sure.
Okay, so just to start the discussion then, one of the big moves they're making here, right? Man is not the king of creation. This is again to drive home the point that this is not anthropocentric. What they're constructing is not anthropocentric, and it's not individual-centric in that manner. That is to say, right, it's not as though the person it is the center of the process.
Something I don't quite get about this, to be honest, is the idea that the process must work to an end, because previously, if I can find it, they say something along the lines of everything is machines and these machines just produce and this production just continues, and this desire is not something that is a desire for something. So I guess I'm trying to reconcile the fact that desire is not a desire for something, but processes are processes that must end.
So when they use the word desire, and it's an important distinction that Lou and a few others mentioned earlier, we've got to be thinking of libido. Desire has a very specific set of connotations in English. I prefer the idea of passions, because that fits more with kind of the classic idea of libidinal desires. But it's this intrinsic flow to being human. And the thing with these flows is they don't really necessarily have any specific aim in mind or a goal. They just are charging it. The way that the machines work or a process works is a process always is about sort of self-termination. It ends somewhere. My process of when I'm a baby drinking mother's milk at some point ends. That you don't eternally drink mother's milk. That the goal of it is the satisfaction of whatever desire, the completion of the machine. You produce a thing for it to end. What they're saying here is that you should not be aiming for a goal. My goal is not literally to become an American. That's a weird, odd thing for me to say. Now, the process of being an American may be its own thing, but the termination of me having a set goal or defining that thing out is not what they're advocating for. Conversely, they're also, sorry, someone want to say something? The second part that is you don't want to keep it going on forever is very much like the infant in the mother's breast. You don't want these processes to be the goal itself either, because that almost seizes itself up in its own way. The idea is to allow the process to sort of, I don't want to say trust or have faith in it, but it's not drastically off of that. It's a belief in the act of the process itself, not in an end goal and saying, oh, the goal is to have the process go on forever. The goal is this. It's like, no, we need to be in the process as it sort of is transitioning and as things are changing, as things are becoming.
I just want to point out that this is a point about the relationship that we as theorizing and politically acting subjects have to the process, right? And how we act on the process, not so much about the nature of the process, like the process for itself. It's about the process for the subject. And I think that's an important distinction when we are getting into this discussion, because if we talk about like they introduce this with it must not be viewed as a goal or an end in itself, and I think that's another caution to just affirming the schizophrenic state or schizophrenic process as like a political goal, right? And I think to what Brooks was saying, maybe there's also a point about in how far we as subjects think about the process in terms of moving entities or developing entities, becoming entities, rather than a process in itself.
So another point is this producer product. That could be seen as a reference to autopoiesis, self-production. And it turns out that, even though Deleuze is thought to be anti-Hegelian, that's a point that Hegel makes toward the end of his logic, that there is this category of producer and product together, which is like the relationship to a concrete universal in Hegel.
Yeah, but we've always got to be careful when putting Hegel and Deleuze or Deleuze and Guattari in relation. Right? They also follow the production as process overtakes all idealistic categories and constitute a cycle whose relationship to desire is that of an immanent principle.
Yeah, just a bit of the historical background that's coming to mind is so I think when Spinoza was writing, and Descartes and all those guys, this question of efficient versus final causes was really big, sort of key question, because like physics had just gotten started, and like machines and sort of mechanisms were being discovered, and so you had that huge debate. And I think Spinoza famously basically rejects final causes, right, for the most part. And he says everything is a kind of mechanism. And the German philosophers like Leibniz and then Kant and everybody who follows, I think final causes, sort of like purposes or teleology, became very important for them. And my sense is that Deleuze and Guattari are following in the Spinozian line, where there's this like universal mechanism or machine, and we don't really talk about purpose. We don't really talk about like having ends or having goals. That's sort of derivative and secondary. And in the first instance, it's like there's just this sort of automatic functioning. Only for them, it's not the functioning of like billiard balls pushing one another, but it's something deeper, like it's desire or it's libido. And it's almost like they want to say all of nature has libido, even like rocks and dust and sand and waves in the sea, like it's all kind of filled with this desire. That's the sense that I get, and I think it's very Spinoza-like, or very like Spinozist, what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree that the rejection of the idea of a final cause for a natural object in Spinoza is very important for Deleuze and Guattari.
Yeah, and I really like this paragraph, and I really like the idea that you don't define the end of the process, as well as we also don't say that this process is infinite, because in both ways we're limiting the process. Because to me, I'm interpreting it as we're imposing an artificial will onto that process instead of letting that process play itself out and seeing what it then produces naturally, organically, because any type of definition would alter, what that process would have produced.
Well, it's also like showing a preference for a linear view of time, right? That something would last forever or have an end. And I think Deleuze would definitely, given that he's a big believer in the plane of eminence, would like to escape this idea of strict cause and effect causality.
Yeah.
How we determine something is the end, right? It's a part of the thing. How do we say it's the end of the thing?
Yeah, no, I think you're dead on there. Right. The second meaning of process that we use the term man and nature are not like two opposite terms confronting each other, not even the sense of bipolar opposites within a relation of causation, ideation, or expression, which they give the examples cause and effect, subject and object, etc. Rather, they are one and the same essential reality, producer product. So yeah, I think you're right about that.
Another point is that he's mentioning D.H. Lawrence here, a quote from him, but D.H. Lawrence wrote two versions of a book against psychoanalysis, and so I think the reference here to D.H. Lawrence is at the beginning is pointing to this previous book rejecting psychoanalysis.
And because I know we've got to move on, let's just take two more points real quick. The third meaning of process in schizophrenia here. So, right, this will be the case, however, only on one condition, which in fact constitutes the third meaning of process, as we use the term. It must not be viewed as a goal or an end in itself, nor must it be confused with an infinite perpetuation of itself. Putting an end to the process or prolonging it indefinitely, which strictly speaking is tantamount to ending it abruptly and prematurely, is what creates the artificial schizophrenic found in mental institutions. So, right, I think we've done a good job of elaborating what they mean, what they're getting on this third meaning. As for the schizophrenic, right, schizophrenia is like love. There is no specifically schizophrenic phenomenon or entity. Schizophrenia is the universe of productive and reproductive desired machines, universal machines, universal primary production as the essential reality of man and nature. So desiring production is schizophrenic in this sense that it's not working through binaries, right? It's not working through clear causation and clear effection. It's not working through clear subject and clear object distinctions. Desiring production is happening without these bipolar opposites, right? And that's what makes it schizophrenic in this sense, is that it's not as though it's taking cues from any like larger categories in the world.
Speaking of, though, I will continue to the next paragraph. Gets us into some Henry Miller, if anyone's a fan of Tropic of Cancer. Desiring machines are binary machines, obeying a binary law or set of rules governing associations. One machine is always coupled with another. The productive synthesis, the production of production, is inherently connective in nature. And then, this is because there is always a flow-producing machine and another machine connected to it that interrupts or draws off part of this flow, the breast or the mouth, as an example. And because the first machine is in turn connected to another, whose flow it interrupts and partially drains off, the binary series is linear in every direction. Desire constantly couples continuous flows and partial objects that are by nature fragmentary and fragmented. Desire causes the current to flow, itself flows in turn, and breaks the flows. Quote, I love everything that flows, even the menstrual flow that carries away the seed unfecund. Tropic of Cancer. To read the footnote, chapter 13. See in the same chapter the celebration of desire as found expressed in the phrase, and my guts spilled out in a grand schizophrenic rush and evacuation leaves me face to face with the absolute. To continue reading. Amniotic fluid spilled out of the sac and kidney stones, flowing hair, flow of spittle, a flow of sperm, shit, urine that are produced by partial objects and constantly cut off by other partial objects, which in turn produce other flows, interrupted by other partial objects. Every object presupposes the continuity of a flow, every flow the fragmentation of an object. Doubtless, each organ machine interprets the entire world from the perspective of its own flux, from the point of view of the energy that flows from it. The eye interprets everything, speaking, understanding, shitting, fucking, in terms of seeing. But a connection with another machine is always established, along a transverse path, so that one machine interrupts the current of the other or sees its own current interrupted. I think actually, Daedric Banana, that actually was almost a direct response to some of the questions you had, so that's nice. Again, talking about what they are trying to say by desiring machine, how these things work. The machine is almost its own, the libidinal machine, the desire machine, is almost its own fuel and its own operation at once. If we think of it as a water wheel that's in the water, you can't have a water wheel without water, and water without a water wheel is fairly pointless. So you end up having these breaks and flows as a stream branches off or as a stream is used by whatever is around it. And each time a little bit is drained off, it goes into its own channel and it connects to other parts of a channel, and it's used in these large scale processes. But at any point, any specific part is the binary singular piece. And they're trying to get down to the point where it's almost atomic, molecular, which they will use quite a bit. And understanding the molecular way that these machines in us work, where my eye is seeing a thing, but it's not that I'm seeing all of these things. I'm seeing things because that's how an eye works. I'm hearing things because that's how an ear works. I'm fucking things because that's how a dick works. These are the things that these things do, and this is how they connect, and this is the setup all the way across. And each step is connected to another, and it's this almost ad nauseum version of the whole. And no, nothing on this one. I can continue on. Some of these paragraphs we found in our reading of the entire thing, there are some paragraphs that just very much stand beautifully on their own and are fairly clear. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to toss them in the chat, but I think I'm going to continue moving on. Hence, the coupling that takes place within the partial object flow connective synthesis also has another form. Product producing. Producing is always something grafted onto the product. And for that reason, desiring production is production of production, just as every machine is a machine connected to another machine. We cannot accept the idealist category of expression as a satisfactory or sufficient explanation of this phenomenon. We must not attempt to describe the schizophrenic object without relating it to the process of production. Not even going to try to pronounce that. I anglicize everything terribly. The thing that they type there in French, a striking confirmation of this principle, since by taking such an approach, they deny there is any such thing as a specific identifiable schizophrenic entity. Or to take another example, Henri Michaud describes a schizophrenic table in terms of a process of production, which is out of desire. Once noticed, continued to occupy one's mind. It even persisted, as it were, in going about its own business. The striking thing was that it was neither simple nor really complex, initially or intentionally complex, or constructed according to a complicated plan. Instead, it had been desimplified in the course of its carpentering. As it stood, it was a table of additions, much like certain schizophrenics' drawings. Described as overstuffed, and if finished, it was only in so far as there was no way of adding anything more to it. The table having become more and more an accumulation, less and less a table. It was not intended for any specific purpose, for anything one expects of a table. Heavy, cumbersome, it was virtually immovable. One didn't know how to handle it, mentally or physically. Its top surface, the useful part of the table having been gradually reduced, was disappearing with so little relation to the clumsy framework that the thing did not strike one as a table, but as some freak piece of furniture, an unfamiliar instrument for which there was no purpose. A dehumanized table. Nothing cozy about it, nothing middle class, nothing rustic, nothing countrified, not a kitchen table or a work table. A table which lent itself to no function, self-protective, denying itself to service and communication alike. There was something stunned about it, something petrified. Perhaps it suggested a stalled engine.
Okay, so let's start here, right? With the, and forgive me for I'm not even going to try and say Anglinize it. I'm just going to butcher it. The Cahiers de l'Art Brut, as close as to the French as I can even fathom. What they're talking about here is a series of monographs issued periodically containing reproductions of artworks created by inmates of the psychiatric asylums of Europe. So, if you haven't seen this, it's worth checking out because it does kind of show what they're talking about here, especially with the schizophrenic table. They're talking about people who had schizophrenia in this sense, or some people who had schizophrenia, maybe not all of them, who created artwork. And in this sense, it doesn't have, what they're trying to show here is this artwork doesn't function in terms of like these clear distinctions. Everything is kind of happening together. Yep, and I'm thinking somebody might post some of them. And it's kind of helpful here because what the story of the schizophrenic table is trying to illustrate for us is how desiring production is working with this table, how its usefulness in that sense, right, is diminishing, right? So like the connections are starting to break off in that sense. The table itself is changing during this process of production, having been produced during it.
And how I read it is when they're talking about most of this, they're saying like, look, there is no such thing as a schizophrenic. Someone is schizophrenic, but there's no schizophrenia as a thing like that we can hold on to or we can say this is what it is. Instead, schizophrenia is a process in the same way that a table tables. A table may be a thing, sure, but eventually a table gets used up and it's not so much a table from the outside anymore. In the same way that a schizophrenic whose drawing may not necessarily be a schizophrenic, their art is the production of schizophrenia as they are outward reaching. Just like a table is tabling, a schizophrenics. And the schizophrenic side of things that is a process is the part that they're extremely focused on. And again, their ultimate argument, I think, is that everything is a process. But they're saying like, look, even the idea of a table, the table it's got all the parts of a table, but at some point it's covered in so much shit because you're using it for a table. It's not really even a table anymore. It's more this weird covered in shit thing. And I can tell you as someone who has two tables currently right next to me, that's the case. Sometimes tables just get covered in crap. Doesn't mean they're not a table. Instead, they're tabling. That's their job. That's their process.
Yeah, and this shows us how things are connecting and disconnecting, right? Because this connectivity is changing, right? And you're starting to see it end with the end of usefulness in a certain sense. But it's more about how the connections themselves also enable all sorts of new connections. And so you get the simultaneity of connectivity and breaking with those connections.
One of the the big introductions, I can't remember if it was Buchanan or Holland, to Anti-Oedipus talks about the schizophrenic table as an example of what happens if you don't have the second synthesis. It's just this continuous connection of desire that kind of cuts off the possibility of other connections and like overstuffs the object.
I don't want to go too deep into it yet, but keep what they're describing here in mind, because they're going to bring this up again when they start discussing the body without organs.
For sure.
I'm not going to go into that right now because it's not in this paragraph.
But I do want to move and talk about the next paragraph, which starts with, the schizophrenic is the universal producer. There is no need to distinguish here between producing and its product. We need to merely note that the pure thisness of the object produced is carried over into a new act of producing. The table continues to go about its business. The surface of the table, however, is eaten up by the supporting framework. The non-termination of the table is a necessary consequence of its mode of production. When Claude Levi-Strauss defines bricolage, he does so in terms of a set of closely related characteristics. The possession of a stock of materials, or of rules of thumb that are fairly extensive, more or less hodgepodge, multiple and at the same time limited. The ability to rearrange fragments continually in new and different patterns of configurations, and as a consequence, an indifference toward the act of producing and toward the product, toward the set of instruments to be used, toward the overall result to be achieved. The satisfaction the handyman experiences when he plugs something into an electric socket or diverts a stream of water can scarcely be explained in terms of playing mommy or daddy, or by the pleasure of violating a taboo. The rule of continually producing production, of grafting producing onto the product, is a characteristic of desiring machines or of primary production. The production of production. A painting by Richard Lindner, The Boy with the Machine, shows a huge, pudgy, bloated boy working one of his little desiring machines after having hooked it up to a vast technical social machine, which, as we shall see, is what even the very young child does. The act of producing produces. It's a positive feedback loop, maybe the way to sort of talk about that.
Mm-hmm. And the process itself is that of the bricoler, right? So it's constantly changing. It's constantly working with what's available, right? And in that matter, it's constantly, there's all this availability for how differences how differences are acting with one another, and how this is being produced and changing through the flux.
One thing that's still not clear to me with regard to the productive unconscious, the idea of the productive unconscious, is the relationship to like need, biological need. I still don't really understand how we can talk about something like hunger without reference to lack.
They're going to work with the idea of lack more directly later on.
Yeah, maybe it's too early for that.
Well, I mean, I can elaborate on that. Is hunger this like single individual, atomized thing? Or is it something that only comes into understanding thanks to a conscious being? Right? The hunger's not in you, it comes from you. There is a human, and then the human is hungry, right? There isn't just this fundamental hunger that we discovered in the world or whatever. It's created by the person.
Well, and anyone who's had an infant would also say that an infant doesn't actually know it's hungry. They experience a need or a desire or something, and they're fussy. They don't really know that they're hungry at any given time. It's the same. I potty training my son, and he doesn't fully understand when he needs to shit either. And that's the thing we're teaching him, because it's a thing we have to learn what it feels like to need to shit.
So it's more of a matter of the production of anti-production and something that exists only on the level of a molar aggregate, such as a human being.
I mean, you can't produce anti-production either, but they talk about that.
Isn't that? I thought that was an important part of the first chapter, production of anti-production. But we can save that for
I
later.
just don't want to talk about it now because they make really good analogies later. So.
Yeah, no, it's a. I mean, even bringing up the molar, I agree that the idea that they're talking about here is that things when they produce, the act of production, the very moment a desiring machine produces, it has a product. It also is producing again, and so there's this continuous chain. We'll talk about that. So when they're talking about even biological needs. And they, when they get into things like the body without organs and all this, the feelings and the ways that hunger exists for a human is not just simply hunger as we point at it, but instead it is a process. It is a process of organs that are generating different nerve endings, causing different sensations around a body. It's the act of us saying, oh, that's hunger, is because we've defined the process as a very specific thing. Instead, the reality is hunger is a series of processes that are all throwing off different resultants things as they go through it.
Yeah, the weirdness about it is it's almost like hunger is a consumption, because the subject is, comes, and see, we're going to be jumping a lot ahead here, but hunger is something that the subject is kind of consumed, and is in that sense hunger having been produced. So the big thing is it's not like you're naturally hungry, right? In that sense, it's not that kind of necessity. It's something that in and of itself, like Brooks is trying to describe there, like biologically, it's something that desiring production in these machines produce, and we kind of find ourselves in that sense experiencing. And I want to make that clear too, because this is where they start elaborating too on like the goal thing. The satisfaction the handyman experiences when he plugs something into an electric socket or diverts a stream of water can scarcely be explained in terms of, quote, playing mommy and daddy, unquote, or by the pleasure of violating a taboo. So this production here, it's not produced in terms of trying to accomplish an end. So it's not consequentialist, yeah? It's not teleological, like we said earlier. And that's important too, even for hunger, because in this way, like, hunger is not produced in the sense of like a larger end. Hunger is produced very imminently in the process.
And actually, we're about to get into how the organs sort of work and play. I'm going to continue reading the next paragraph.
Just a quick,
please.
Weinberg said, yeah, just a response to that. So it sounds like what's really important for DNG is that, like in our basic ontology, there is no lack. Like what things are at bottom, it's purely positive. And so, we have phenomena like hunger, but we want to explain those based on positivity, not based on like some essential void, or, other philosophers will talk about the void. And I don't think that's really a thing for Deleuze and Guattari, right? They, so I'm looking also at, they were a little bit earlier, they were talking about the productive synthesis. And the way they explain, so it says, this is because there's always a flow producing machine and another machine connected to it that interrupts and draws off part of this flow. And so it seems like that's kind of how hunger would be produced. Let's say I have my state of homeostasis or whatever, but then there's another machine that's kind of drawing off that flow. And that's what hunger is. Hunger is not some like fundamental void or lack within the nature of the subject or something. And so I'm wondering if that's right, because that would make a lot of sense to me, that it's kind of like there is a plenum originally, right? There's a fullness of being, and the voids, they're just images, or they're just sort of secondary phenomena or simulacra. There are no voids sort of in the nature of things.
Well, as they'll get to later, there's nothing to be inherently found within the subject at all, even. There's nothing inside the subject. It just produces, seemingly miraculously.
Yeah, the subject has to be produced, right? And in that sense, it's not even like it's not a clear eye. But yeah, we'll get into how they understand lack, which is very different than like the typical way we understand lack. more in chapter 2.
For now, we'll continue. Producing product identity. It is this identity that constitutes a third term in the linear series, an enormous, undifferentiated object. Everything stops dead for a moment, everything freezes in place, and then the whole process will begin all over again. From a certain point of view, it would be much better if nothing worked, nothing functioned. Never being born, escaping the wheel of continual birth and rebirth, no mouth to suck on, no anus to shit through. Will the machines run so badly, their component pieces fall apart to such a point that they will return to nothingness and thus allow us to return to nothingness? It would seem, however, that the flows of energy are still too closely connected. Partial objects still too organic for this to happen. What would be required is a pure fluid in a free state, flowing without interruption, streaming over the surface of a full body. Desiring machines make us an organism, but the very heart of this production, within the very production of this production, the body suffers from being organized in this way, from not having some other sort of organization, or no organization at all. Quote, an incomprehensible, absolutely rigid stasis, end quote, in the very midst of process as the third stage. No mouth, no tongue, no teeth, no larynx, no esophagus, no belly, no anus. The automata stop dead and set free the unorganized mass they once served to articulate. The full body without organs is the unproductive, sterile, the unengendered, the unconsumable. Antonin Artaud discovered this one day, finding himself with no shape or form whatsoever, right there where he was at that moment. The death instinct, that is its name, and death is not without a model. For desire desires death also, because the full body of death is its motor, just as it desires life, because the organs of life are the working machine. We shall not inquire how all this fits together so that the machine will run. The question itself is the result of a process of abstraction. I will recommend, if you are interested, our literature group very early on did a reading of Antonin Artaud's work that they basically borrow very heavily from There Before the Judgment of God, I believe it's called, Jack?
It's To Have Done with the Judgment.
To Have Done with the Judgment of God. It's in our recorded readings, on our podcast page. It's one of our earlier episodes, 100% worth listening through. It explains a great deal of what they're referring to and what Artaud was getting at and what he was going through, and their references here. It's too dense for me to explain here, but it's very worth going into.
To start then, this is something I've been wondering too, and Ken, I'm hoping you can help us out here before we go too deep into the body without organs here. Can you give us just a brief understanding of undifferentiation and undifferentiated objects in psychoanalysis? Because what they did here in that manner was kind of lost on me.
Maybe not in psychoanalysis. I can't. If someone else can
ask again for me, Jack. What was that?
I can do it through like the way Jung talks about it, right? Where so differentiation is giving something form, right? Giving something a temporality, locale, having it have features like density or texture, or color and brightness, things like that, right? And the more differentiated something gets, the less you can make an identity with it. The less that function of identity works. The more undifferentiated a thing gets, the more a representational it gets, right? And the more you start to lose something like a final cause, because it's not necessarily a static representation now. And like motion brings together a certain quality of undifferentiation, right? Gets all blurry and stuff like that. So there's like various qualities, and it's a big range between an undifferentiated object and a differentiated object. And through differentiation, you lose something like motion or animation and stuff like that.
Well, and it's important. This is absolutely a callback to, I believe, Difference in Repetition, where Deleuze very much starts talking through old Freudian thought and how energy sort of operates, and how the differences in minute differences between every moment between things is actually how change comes about. The differences is the evolution. There is an undifferentiated object. It's almost, I later, in one of the readings later, talked through it. I referred to it almost as think of it as heat death of the universe. There's no energy, there's no anything. That's when they refer to this death, that there is no movement, that all is sort of like Ice Nine, frozen and stilted. No energy left. It's in that moment that everything stops for a moment. And that's the death they're talking about.
Then they aren't talking about, sorry, y'all. I was just curious, then they aren't talking about death drive, right?
Not directly. They're saying like the death drive is modeled after the body without organs. So see, they're kind of, this is what I mean too, like with the undifferentiation. They're juxtaposing what they're doing here conceptually with the typical psychoanalytic understanding.
Yeah, I think just at like a very basic level, what they're doing in this paragraph is introducing, without naming it, introducing the concept of anti-production, which is the body without organs rejecting the connection of the organs, but it's also the force that breaks the desiring machines apart. But I think that is related to the death drive. I think it's kind of, at least as I understand it, it's kind of their answer to it.
Yeah, it would be the Freudian death drive, right? Which is like that nirvana principle, or like the principle of entropy, where things move to their inanimate form, right? But then Lacan does something different with death drive, and it's much more of like an animating factor where a thing circles around a thing that it can't attain precisely because it can't attain it. And then you get beyond the pleasure principle and stuff like that from that concept.
It is worth noting that in this text, particularly, Deleuze and Guattari are never saying one thing when they very carefully worded things specifically to speak in multiplicities, as it were. They always mean more than one thing. So they definitely are throwing shade at Lacan and Freud here for thinking, in both cases, right, and thinking that there is like this drive towards an end, this death drive in the Freudian sense, and the Lacanian sense that there's like no way to ever fulfill this drive.
The last line there, I'd love anyone else to give thoughts, because it's always read to me also as doing just that. We shall not inquire how all this fits together so the machine will run. Even asking that is a process of abstraction. Is just it's snarky French shittiness is how I read it. Like it's not, we can't do that. It's a process of abstraction. We're no longer talking about literally how things work at a material level. We're abstracting away, and that's, I mean, a reference to Lacan and Freud as well. Sort of, again, shade at them. How I read it.
Yeah, I think to an extent they're saying we will not be put in a box. Do not put us in a box, right? Never stop. Don't think like, oh, yeah, this is what they're saying, and this is that, and this is that. Boom. Deleuze and Guattari. They're like, no, stop. there is no end to it or whatever. There's no drive towards an end.
Yeah, it's the process being, and the process itself being the goal is the discussion of how the process works. The moment we've effectively named the process, it's abstracted, and we've actually stultified and almost killed it by the way they talk about these things.
Yeah, in that process, you make representations, right? And well, I had something more to say, but totally slipped me. I'm sorry about that.
No, that's good. I'm going to continue to the final paragraph, and then we'll just open up chat and get through this. We got 10-15 minutes left, I think. Desiring machines work only when they break down, by continually breaking down. Judge Schreber lived for a long time without a stomach, without intestines, almost without lungs, with torn esophagus, without a bladder, and with shattered ribs. He used, sometimes, to swallow part of his own larynx with his food, etc. The body without organs is non-productive. Nonetheless, it is produced at a certain place and a certain time in the connective synthesis as the identity of producing and the product. The schizophrenic table is a body without organs. A body without organs is not the proof of an original nothingness, nor is it what remains of a lost totality. Above all, it is not a projection. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the body itself or with the image of the body. It is the body without an image. This imageless, organless body, the non-productive, exists right where it is produced, in the third stage of the binary linear series. It is perpetually reinserted into the process of production. The catatonic body is produced in the water of the hydrotherapy tub. The full body without organs belongs to the realm of anti-production. But yet another characteristic of the connective or productive synthesis is the fact that it couples production with anti-production, an element of anti-production. That's the end of the section. We are going to be, next week, we are going to be doing an hour, maybe two, on literally what the body without organs is. I just wanted to insert that because please don't ask here, what is the body without organs? That is not a thing I think it's possible for us to have the discussion right now. I would love to answer your question, trust me, but it is not a thing that is easy to answer. So we will be having a discussion for that next week. Please join us, and we will be literally only talking about the body without organs and what it does and its effects. Now, please, any questions or comments regarding this section, aside from asking what is a body without organs?
What's really opening things up for me, and this is relating to the last discussion, the last paragraph, where he says the full body of death is its motor. So for desire, desire is death also, because the full body of death is its motor. And I guess that answers, so if desire is a machine, how does the machine run? And somehow the death drive or death instinct or this body of death, whatever that is making desire run. And I find that really interesting because I think it's very different from at least like your typical psychoanalytic, why do we desire? Well, to live. And here it seems like he's saying, no, actually we desire because of death. And that's really counterintuitive. And then he goes on, just as it desires life, because the organs of life are the working machine. So it seems like the living body is the machine itself, but then there's this deeper level, like there's this motor or engine that's making it all run, and that's somehow at the level of death, whatever that means. So I find that really interesting, and in a way it seems like it's kind of like they're doing this ontological reading of the death drive, right? The death drive is not just some material stuff in the body or some tendency in the body, but there's this deeper, like an ontology of sorts or something transcendental or whatever. That's connected with this death instinct. So it's all kind of, I mean, for me, it's kind of mystifying, right? But it's interesting.
Yeah, but at the same time, they're referring to, when they say, when they talk about death or life, or it's, we're not supposed to be talking about the body without organs, but there's two poles, it's like the machine as zero intensity or a full body, like it's, you need space for desire to express itself. So it's always like an oscillation between those two poles, and that's how it's functioning.
Yeah, I'll elaborate on this death thing you were speaking of earlier, and that they're absolutely taking a huge amount of inspiration from both Derrida and Heidegger here, specifically in that there's this idea within common understanding, right, that there's this medical death, and then boom, you stop being a social being, you're a non-social being, and you have no value anymore, right? And Heidegger and Derrida kind of say, well, I suppose I'll explain the Derrida side of it first, is that there's two futures, right? There's the predictable future, and there's the future that you can't predict. And the predictable future is not in the future. It's happening now because you can predict it, and it's affecting you now. So it's a part of the present. in the same sense that your predictable death, your eventual death, is always with you. There is no end to you. You always live with your death because it's a predictable future. And I would say the same about that with regards to all of these processes, when it comes to desire in general, is that every desire, part of every desire or process or whatever, is its end, and its end lives with it throughout. There is no distinction between the end of the process and the process.
Yeah, I really like your explanation there. So at this point, right, they're walking out what they're calling the connective synthesis, which is their first passive synthesis of the unconscious, which we'll expound on more later on, but just to call that out because they do at the end. So, right, we've got desiring machines and desiring production in relation to all these connections, right? These different machines connecting and thereby producing. We've got those flows of energy in that. And so with this series of connections, right, the body without organs takes place, yeah. One of the things I wanted to highlight here is, let me see here. Desiring machines make us an organism. At the very heart of this production, within the very production of this production, the body suffers from being organized in this way, from not having some other sort of organization or no organization at all. Let me see here. I gotta find the part I'm looking at, but they talk about what the body without organs does here, right, is it's allowing, it's working with this organization, right, but it's also working back against it from the standpoint of the of no organization or the possibilities of different organizations. So the body without organs, in this sense, I'm trying to find the line what they say. The machines break down from the very thing they serve to articulate. But in this sense, it's kind of what Roger was getting at with the body without organs, as sort of empowering this from the standpoint of what we think of as death. But it's not death in that normal sense, right? It's death in the sense of no organization or the possibilities of different organizations. So like potentiality in that sense.
If I could take a crack at anti-production as well, that's been brought up a few times.
Please.
So I think there's a mistake when we try to say anti-production is like against production or the opposite of production. I think maybe a better way of putting it would be a production, that it is not production. And so this idea of producing anti-production never actually happens. Like anti-production can't be produced. And they elaborate on this later. And I'm not allowed to talk about the body without organs yet, but it's an illusion, right? It just seems like anti-production is produced, but it's not anything. It's not a production. It's more like a record or a scripture, and it just seems like things connect to the anti-production, but they actually like are almost miraculously connected to it. But it's all ethereal.
Well, so this is why my sentence that, and I'm not saying it's exactly right. And Jack he said not quite. I'm like, yeah, I know it's not quite, but I'm trying to point at the thing. As I've understood, let's say in capitalism, anti-production is a series of edicts that is part of the sort of way that capital works, or a king may put out edicts that tells us not to do certain things, or that certain things are anathema. Society may tell us not to do stuff. Those elements being integrated into the desiring machines are anti-production. They are the element that is essentially a version of repression. But it's always anti-production isn't something we make internally to our desiring machines. It's something that exists outside of it and comes at I don't want to use the word outside because I know there really isn't one, but we're talking effectively about molar.
It's a fake outside, effectively.
Yeah, it's a fake outside. It's something that's more molar than molecular, though. So it's part of the molar regime rather than the molecular, that is determining that you can't do X and Y. That is a break in the flows that is not necessarily something that is, I don't want to say natural, but is not a real break in flow.
Mm-hmm. I found the quote I was looking for. But yeah, the body without organs is connecting production with anti-production. The only thing I'm critical of there is the use of repression, because that has a lot of baggage in it, and they're going to work with that in terms of representation that later on. So, right, we're talking about how production is sort of work, kind of like what you were saying. I'm trying to think of your name. It was Owl. Anyways, yeah, it's like you're saying, where there's this connection between the two through the body without organs, that they're working on each other, but it's not as though it's not a transcendence in that sense. The sentence I really wanted to focus on was the automata stop dead and set free the unorganized mass they once served to articulate. The full body without organs is the unproductive, and they go on to say that, to explain it there. But in this sense, it's like you're saying, with the body without organs, the desiring machines seem to miraculate, and we'll see later where they seem to repulse in that sense too. But the body without organs is empowering all this in relation to desiring production. And desiring production in that sense is it's productive and it's anti-productive, right? It's not distinct from the two.
Yeah, I mean, we can't talk about the BWA yet, but as much as I would like to, better to save that for later. But I mean, I think they may be making some like Marxian statement as well. I know Deleuze likes Marxian a lot as well, but I think it is a trap to think of anti-production as something that stops production. I think it's like an a-production, like nothing is produced. It just isn't production, rather than it stops production.
Yeah, it's not a matter and antimatter, and that's the anti really makes it difficult to sort of work my brain separately than that. It's not antimatter where you combine them and then the thing goes away. It's a non-production, almost the same way that like Laruelle talks about non-philosophy. It's not anti-philosophy or anti-psychiatry. It's not that. It's everything that is.
A-production, I think.
A-production, I think, works best. Yeah, it's a fun one. And we are going to be continuing Anti-Oedipus. Despite us finished our reading and us sort of restarting, Anti-Oedipus is going to be a foundational thing that we continue on the server for essentially the foreseeable future. So any of you who are currently reading it, please continue. Join us on it. And we plan fully to continue to have these discussions. Thank all of you for joining, for sure, very much.